In this segment, we're going to spend some time growing our knowledge around monitoring for learning. The learning targets for this segment are: I understand the components of monitoring for student learning. I understand the connection between monitoring for student learning and formative data to inform my next instructional move. I understand the teacher moves necessary to monitor student learning. And I can coach my mentee on the moves he or she will need to make to grow his or her practice in monitoring student learning. As we look at our district's vision of instructional excellence, we need to consider how we will know if a student is building strong content knowledge, thinking critically, collaborating and communicating effectively, and how we will know if students are taking ownership of their learning and reflecting on their progress. We will only know the answer to those questions if we are monitoring their learning each and every day. The more teachers monitor their students and reflect on how they are progressing in that learning process, the better equipped they will be to adjust instruction and meet their students' needs. The late Rick DeFore stated, "The difference between a good teacher and a great teacher is the relentless inspection of student work." How true that is. The more often we monitor and reflect on student learning, the more informed we are. The more informed we are, the better we are at meeting our students' needs. But the question is, what will we monitor? As we learned from our study of the teaching map, we will monitor the conditions in our classroom with respect to rules and procedures, engaging students, and noticing when they are not engaged, establishing and maintaining effective relationships, and communicating high expectations for all students, no matter their background or perceived abilities. We will also monitor the learning taking place for each student through the evidence they provide. Are they meeting the expectation for this particular target? What evidence did he or she provide to demonstrate that? The evidence helps us reflect on the next instructional decision we will make. Will I need to pull a small group? Is that something I can address one-on-one? Will this require a whole class reteach? One way we monitor student learning is by asking questions. Reflect for a moment about how you have students answer questions in your classroom. No doubt, many of you said that we ask students to raise their hands and we call on them one at a time. Consider the advantages to having students raise their hands. We might say that format is orderly and that everyone can be heard. Now consider the limitations to that method. We might say the same students always answer. Not everyone engages in that type of environment. I personally, as a teacher, don't know what everyone is thinking, or it might allow students to be off the hook, so to speak. Take a moment to read over this quote. You may need to read it a couple of times. I did the first time I read it. How does that statement connect with what you were thinking with the previous slide? This really validates our thoughts regarding the limitations of answering questions one at a time. Notice where this quote came from. The first time I saw this quote, it took me back a bit, because this is how I answered questions when I was in school. This is how we were trained in our education programs to ask questions. And we have to keep order in our classroom, right? Well, consider this thought. Our goal as a teacher is to build knowledge in all students. Education is meant to level the playing field, not to widen the gap. When I took a moment to reflect on the impact this one strategy was having on my students, I felt a change was necessary. And I'm confident you felt something similar when reading this quote. The question is, what do we do now? How can I help my mentee avoid this in his or her classroom? This quote was shared with me a few years ago, and it totally applies to our amazing profession as educators. We work really hard each and every day to do the very best for our students. Over time and through research, we are better able to determine the strongest practices. And as a result, when we know better, we do better. This is exactly one of those cases. With that being said, we will now take some time to learn how to better monitor student learning so we know exactly where each and every one of our students is on their learning continuum. Monitoring is using evidence from what students do, say, make, or write so we can infer what they understand, know, feel, or think. We traditionally think of monitoring happening in a formal way, some sort of quiz, exit ticket, end of module or unit task, or a formal assessment. However, we design really good activities and ask really thoughtful questions and have students share their thinking all the time. Every one of those is an opportunity to collect data on our students' thinking. When they engage in those standards-aligned activities, answer those strategically selected questions, and engage in collaborative conversations, they are doing, saying, making, or writing something. They are making their learning visible to us, and that's evidence, and that's definitely data we can use. Monitoring is formally defined as the teacher act of checking evidence for desired student learning of critical content during instruction. If we were to break apart that and really dissect that statement, we would find 4 key parts to that work. It's the teacher act, walking, watching, or listening, of checking student evidence, anything students do, say, make, or write, of the desired learning of critical content, the most important content we're trying to get across to them, and it's during instruction, while they are in front of us. Traditionally, we've been really good at monitoring the conditions for learning. We make note of when students are engaged or not engaged, and take steps to get them back on task. We're also good at ensuring students are following the rules and procedures. However, if we focus solely on compliance and engagement, then we are missing the opportunity to formatively assess student learning during instruction. This is critical data that we can use in the moment to correct misconceptions and extend students' thinking while they're still in front of us. This slide represents several opportunities within the learning continuum to collect data on student learning. Looking to the middle and right boxes on the slide, you'll notice end-of-unit assessments and across lessons as the titles. We routinely look at end-of-unit assessments, for example, our ELA tasks, tests, and end-of-module assessments, as well as quizzes, mid-module assessments, and exit tickets to determine where students are in their learning progression. Those are necessary data points to collect, and we want to continue that practice. Those opportunities allow us to make instructional decisions for the next lesson, for small group instruction, for review sessions, and/or Tier 2 intervention groups to provide additional practice with the grade level standards we are working on. The next step in growing our practice is to layer in monitoring student learning within a lesson. When we are really clear on what we expect our students to be doing, saying, making, and writing, and know specifically what to listen for during their collaborative conversations, we can make adjustments in the moment and correct any misconceptions while the students are still present in the room and before the end of the lesson. We can also take the opportunity to extend student learning for those who quickly grasp concepts. Think about the power this move has on student learning. If we catch the misconception during instruction, our exit tickets will show a higher level of proficiency. The more students will leave the building knowing the content and will be ready to complete the homework we may have assigned. If we don't catch the misconception before students leave the building, they may easily give up on homework, not complete it at all, or worse off, practice the work incorrectly. So how does this practice connect to our work in a PLC? When we unpack our standards for a unit or module of instruction, we ask our members, what do we want all students to learn? Once we have a clear understanding of what our standards are asking us to teach and our students to learn, then we develop that success criteria for mastery. This includes creating or determining the assessments we will use to measure proficiency, but it also includes those strongly aligned activities we develop within a lesson sequence. We need to know exactly what we expect students to do, say, make, or write when answering those intentionally planned questions or completing those activities. If we are clear on what we expect, we can better diagnose where students are and make adjustments in the moment to further their learning. Next, we select a strategy to make learning visible. The purpose is to design the opportunity for all students to engage in the work and to demonstrate what they are thinking. Think back to the limitations of raising hands and calling on one student that we discussed earlier in this segment. That structure limits how many students you can truly assess. If you were to pick one of these strategies listed in the purple box, or others that make students' learning visible, you can monitor what every student is thinking, and that's powerful data. Now that we know what to look or listen for and have selected the strategy to capture student thinking, it's time to monitor the learning. This is where we will walk, watch, and listen, checking for the evidence of learning we established with PLC questions 1 and 2. When we use the information we collect when walking, watching, and listening to adjust our instruction in the moment, adjusting our instruction means we would have probing questions or other scaffolds prepared in advance to guide students closer to our expectations. It could also mean pulling a small group of students who are struggling to a table for a quick clarification or a mini lesson. Additionally, we don't want to forget about our higher level learners. Therefore, we anticipate what students will grasp the content quickly and have a question or other extension ready to stretch their learning. This is a great conversation to have in a PLC because every other member brings a whole host of different experiences and strategies in their toolbox to the table. If we only discuss PLC questions 3 and 4, what will we do when students learn and don't learn? After a formal assessment, we are missing an opportunity to learn from each other prior to instruction and aren't as prepared to meet the needs of all of our students. As teachers grow their practice, they will go through 4 phases. First, teachers learn about monitoring, similar to what you are doing right now. Then, teachers will begin to implement some strategies in the classroom. When teachers successfully implement the strategy, then they are able to actively monitor student learning and collect some formative data. As they become fluent in that, teachers can truly impact learning because they'll use the adaptations they've prepared in advance to meet the needs of all students. Now let's take a moment to reflect on our own practice of monitoring student learning. Read over the Teacher Moves for Monitoring Student Learning document that you printed at the beginning of this segment. You'll notice the bullet points under each of the 4 phases of the implementation. As you read through the moves, place a check mark next to any move you currently do on a regular basis. Not what you know to be the right move and want to do, but what you actually do each and every day. Then, circle any moves you could incorporate into your daily practice to strengthen how you monitor student learning in the moment. If you find it helpful, annotate the text by underlining or highlighting the key components of each move. Really take your time in digesting this information, as we will be using what you learned in the upcoming segments, and it will also help you develop your mentee skills in this area. Go ahead and pause the video at this time while you complete this activity. What you may have noticed is that you have a few more check marks towards the top of the page, and slowly they become more circles than checks. This is quite common and not to worry. This is an informal assessment of your current practice, and now you have concrete, actionable steps you can take to grow your practice and the practice of any future mentees. You may also have noticed a lighter amount of check marks in the monitoring phase, and then maybe a few more in the adapting phase. This can occur because we work with varying levels of students, and we are trying to meet their needs. The key thing to remember is that our ultimate goal is to monitor during instruction and adapt in the moment, not just create an adaptation to use after the lesson has taken place. Support after the lesson is important as well, but we also want to address the misconception in the moment to have higher proficiencies at the end of the lesson. The graphic on the slide captures this very thought. The concept of monitoring for learning centers on the goal of 100% of our students achieving success by mastering the standards. Both teacher and student focus on the learning target throughout the lesson, keeping it in the forefront of their mind. As students take in chunks of content, process, elaborate, record, and reflect on that chunk, teachers provide opportunities to make learning visible and then monitor where students are at with their learning, keeping in mind the criteria for success previously determined. It is then that adaptations are utilized to assist students with getting closer to the target. It's a cycle that is repeated until all students demonstrate proficiency, especially if the standard we are teaching is considered an essential standard. Collecting that formative data as you walk, watch, and listen is crucial to helping teachers determine their next instructional move. The following slides offer 2 different options for collecting that data in the moment. The first example comes from the book Teach Like a Champion. Prior to monitoring, the teacher answered the questions, always a best practice, thought about some review points, and determined what he or she was going to specifically look for while observing student work. This information is captured on the document. During the act of monitoring, he or she selected specific students to share their thinking and wrote their names on the document, including why they were selected. This is an important teacher move because sharing of student thinking hits several of the core actions necessary to deepen student understanding of critical content. This means the teacher may call on students who solve problems using different methods, strategies, or students who have different answers in order to have rich conversation about methods, accuracy, and efficiency. The teacher would also write the names of students who missed the mark and didn't quite show evidence of mastering the target. The second example is a facilitation grid. The teacher follows the same steps as on the previous slide in order to prepare for monitoring. Along the left side of the document, teachers would list the names of students in that class or period, depending on the grade being taught. Across the top of the document, teachers would list the targets being taught for that module or unit of instruction. Not the standard, but the targets or chunks of learning that make up that standard. The reason for using targets is so teachers can narrow in and get to the root of the misconception. As the teacher walks, watches, and listens, as well as reviews exit tickets or quizzes, he or she would then mark when evidence of mastery is present for that target, based on the criteria for success previously established. We know that one example does not always mean the student has mastered the content, so we provide multiple examples of evidence of mastery to ensure the student truly meets proficiency for that target. The facilitation grid could be stapled to a file folder. I recommend a bright one so that it can be seen from anywhere in the room, or in a stack of papers on a desk, on a clipboard, or created in a digital format on an iPad. Those options provide ease of use as the teacher walks about the room listening and observing. No matter what method a teacher uses to collect this data, what he or she does with the data is most important. Why monitor a problem if you aren't going to fix it? The data should be used to determine the next instructional move. Options could range from pulling a small group in the moment or at the beginning of the next class, to reteaching the entire class if the vast majority of students are struggling, to addressing the misconception in the moment on an individual basis. Addressing the student in the moment is called making an adaptation. As we walk, watch, and listen, we are determining if a student is meeting expectation. If we observe a student struggling, we can provide a scaffold to guide their thinking. If we observe a student quickly meeting expectations, we can provide an extension to stretch their thinking and continue their growth while keeping him or her engaged. This also allows the teacher the necessary time to reach all students. Pause this video for a moment to review the Monitoring for Learning handout you downloaded at the beginning of this segment. On the back side of the document are several examples of scaffolds and extensions that could be used. What the teacher selects determines on the amount of time allotted. One of the easiest ways to provide an adaptation is through questioning. In your PLCs, think about the question or task the students will answer or complete. Plan a few questions to guide or scaffold their thinking if they get stuck, and plan a few questions to extend student thinking if they are on target with their answers. To plan your scaffold or extension questions, think about the complexity level of the task. Use the question stems on the taxonomy to design additional opportunities to scaffold or extend thinking. Here's an example of questions used for adapting instruction in the moment. Our standard is to describe the basic differences between physical weathering, the breaking down of rock by wind, water, ice, temperature change in plants, and the erosion caused by movement of rock by gravity, wind, water, or ice. Our assessment is students will write a short paragraph describing the differences between physical weathering and erosion. To scaffold student thinking, I consider that this standard lives at the analysis level by looking at the verbs. So I will go down one level on the taxonomy to comprehension to determine my scaffolding questions or other activities. For example, I could ask students to describe what happens during physical weathering, describe what happens during erosion, or I could have students create a comparison matrix with the information for weathering and erosion in their respective columns. Then have students highlight anything that is different or unique to each aspect. I would then ask them to use those highlights to describe the differences. To extend student thinking, I will consider that this standard again lives at the analysis by looking at the verbs, so then I will go up one level on the taxonomy to knowledge utilization to extend student thinking. Here I create an activity that students will design something that will reduce or eliminate physical weathering and or erosion of an object. This falls under the problem-solving section of knowledge utilization. As you plan your scaffolds and extensions, consider the following questions. How will I know which students need adaptations? How will I note which students need the adaptations? Do the adaptations align to the instructional strategy I'm using? And are the adaptations doable in that lesson and that time period? Here is an example of a planning template that could be used when planning a chunk of content, keeping monitoring in mind. Notice it starts with the standard and learning targets. Teachers then consider the strategies that will be used to teach the content, the activities students will engage in to process the content or deepen their learning, how the teacher will monitor the learning, any adaptations that will be used, and the criteria for success he or she will be looking for, as well as the assessment that will be used. This template can also be downloaded in this module. This concludes the segment on monitoring for learning. After reflecting on what you learned in this segment, think about how you will use this information to impress upon your mentee the importance of monitoring student learning during instruction as a regular practice. What information from this segment would you share with your mentee? You will submit your discussion post by clicking on the link at the bottom of this module page.